Hi again guys, and welcome to, of course, another car review from the world of GT Sport. And this is a category of vehicle which we have talked about occasionally, but we don't tend to cover it quite as often, for instance as the Group 3 or the Group 1 cars, or even some of the Group X's. And the reason for that isn't necessarily because I've chosen not to, it just hasn't really worked out that way 9 times out of 10. But the vehicle in question is a Group 4 car, and the car is, of course, the Corvette. The Corvette C7 Group 4 race car. Now this car has a lot of similarities, obviously, to other Group 4s. The price, for instance, is of course the same as all the others, $350,000, just like all of the Group 3 cars are $450,000, all of the Group X's are $1 million, etc, etc. So of course there's no surprises there. However, where the differentiation happens between these classes, and as I've said before, especially when it comes to Group 4, is because the category is so varied with exotics, muscle cars, potentially, and stuff like even hot hatches being included in that same class. It means that the difference between the vehicles can be much more drastic in terms of what you'd expect it to do compared to what it actually does. Compare that to, for instance, a Group 3 car where they're pretty much all, to some degree, existing high-performance vehicles. Whereas in this regard, you can have Scirocco's and Megans going up against Vipers and Ferrari 458s. So of course, when you bring something like a Corvette into that mix, you have certain advantages, for sure. Its racing lineage, for instance, how fast and how good it already is, the very prime balance of performance and good handling that a Corvette has pretty much always had, one of the reasons why it's so successful. But also at the same time, in a similar way to the Viper, the Ferrari, the Lambo, you have a big disadvantage against those hot hatches. A Megane or a Scirocco, etc., they don't need to be detuned, they're already well under the limits of power, so they are upgraded to Group 4 limits, whereas something like this has to be severely downgraded. Now, speaking of downgrading those specs, what I mean in that regard is, of course, that the standard Stingray of the C7 generation is putting out, 450, 460 horsepower, thereabouts. This one, on the other hand, is putting out 414. Now, one of the good things about that is it means that that 414 horsepower, combined with even more torque, 419 pound-feet, that means it hasn't had anywhere near as much of a drop as many of the other cars in this category. The Viper, for instance, took a huge loss from well over 600 horsepower. Likewise with the Ferrari 458, it takes a massive loss from around 570 horsepower. This is no way near that kind of discrepancy. And the brilliant thing about that is that the Corvette C7 Stingray, despite not being, a Z06 or a ZR1, it's already such a good car in its road form that making it into a race car and taking away barely any power, but also significantly dropping the weight, giving it closer gearing, more downforce, slick tyres, you're essentially making a recipe for a virtually perfect Group 4 car. Now, whether or not it actually pans out that way, of course, is another question. So, does it? Well, to some degree, I would say, yeah, it kind of does. This is an excellent choice of Group 4. Now, I'm not going to claim that this would beat everything out there, because of course, balance of performance can always change the tables on a dime. You change the track, you change the driver, you change the balance of performance. Those three things have the biggest bearing on any car. So of course it can change. But I will say that there are certain vehicles which set themselves apart as being a very good option, such as the Nissan GT-R, the Corvette, a few others too. And to me, this is simply one of those options. It's such a good car already that when you turn it into a race car, as I said, improve the downforce, improves the grip, drop the weight, and barely drop the power at all, well, of course it's going to be good. It would be very difficult for it to be bad. And in a funny kind of way, I would actually say that this car is in arguably the perfect position for being a Group 4 interpretation. And also another vehicle that I would say is in a pretty much perfect category as well is the Porsche Cayman, because once again you don't see a huge discrepancy between the power and the spec, in terms of the power and torque in particular, of that one and the road car, compared to what you would with those Vipers and Ferraris and Lamborghini Huracans. That's a great place to be because it's right in the middle of the board. It's an exotic, but it's way beyond a hot hatch, but not on the level of a full-on supercar. So of course I would say to check out this Corvette. In terms of value, the fact that they're all the same price inherently means that when it comes to Group 3 or Group 4, or pretty much any group for that matter, but especially these, when it's more about which one has the better handling, 9 times out of 10 rather than the better straight line speed, it really does come down to which one suits you the best. Because there's such a huge difference between the cars in this category. I mean, there really is a massive difference. Consider the front-wheel drive Audi TT Quattro, for instance, or the front-wheel drive Megane, or the Scirocco. Compare that to this, or the Viper, or the aforementioned Lamborghini and Ferrari. Of course they're going to handle completely differently. Whereas in Group 3, you very rarely find that. You find rear-wheel drive, more often than not mid-engine, sometimes front-engine, but they're much closer. Audi R8s, Huracans, 458s, Vipers, Corvettes, in those Group 3 forms, they feel on much more of a level playing field to begin with, without even applying any tuning. Whereas in this class, you've got cars that are being tuned up to meet the regulations with front-wheel drive, you've got cars being tuned down to it with rear-wheel drive. It's a mosh pit, if you will, of racing classes, and it's one of the most unique classes in the game for that kind of opposition. It's one of the reasons why it's so popular. So for me, I would say that the Corvette is, in a funny kind of way, falling into a similar position as the GTR. And to some degree, this kind of started in GT6, and that is that, as I've always said about this Corvette, it was the hero car of Gran Turismo 6, and I predicted that it would continue to be alongside the new NSX, which I thought would be the hero car of this game. Now, to some degree, you could say that that's the case with all of the different rally, racing, road variations of said NSX, but not really to the degree that I said, and that mostly changed because the nature of the game changed. Whereas the Corvette, and what I was saying about it falling into a similar category to the GTR, is that there are certain cars that we get so familiar with, we come to expect them to be so good, that when they are good, we're not surprised anymore, but if they're not good, we notice. That's a shame. It's like having one blemish on an otherwise perfectly painted wall. You only notice the blemish. That's a shame, because it means that we take these brilliant cars which are so good that they become borderline boring even, in terms of, if nothing else, just choosing them to begin with, let alone driving them. Then that's a shame. Those cars should not be undervalued, they should not be underappreciated. This one doesn't fall as badly into that category as a GTR does, but it's still in very definite danger, I would say, falling into that same kind of group. So don't sleep on this Corvette. It's definitely a good choice, and this might be controversial, but I might even say that I believe that the Corvette suits Group 4 even better than it does Group 3. Because although it's a great Group 3 race car, Group 3 is so close that in Group 4 you notice the cars that are better so much more clearly. And for me, this is clearly one of the better Group 4 cars out there, one of the best. It certainly suits my handling style. I would say the handling is pretty much perfect on this thing. The proportions are good, it's not hyper small, but it's still very nimble. The power is, as we've said, close to stock, so it's still fast in a straight line. It's just a good car overall. So if you want to try something which maybe people are using all the time, maybe people aren't depending on the race, then go with this one. It's not as obvious as a GTR, but it offers every bit that kind of competitive nature. And for Corvette fans and for Corvette lineage, it definitely lives up to the name. So this is probably one of my favourite Group 4 cars, definitely worth checking out. And that's it for this pick overall. So of course I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.